Oh, thank you for joining us today, Kevin. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and your connection with the Calgary Gay History project?
Sure. Well, I'm a fourth generation Calgarian, and in about 2012, I started something called the Calgary Gay History Project. I was just very curious. I grew up in Calgary, and my parents are from Calgary, and I was curious about where gay people existed in the 50s and 60s. And so that's how the project got started. And then quite early on in the project, I discovered the story of Calgary bus driver Everett Clippert, who was famous for his court cases in the 60s, who eventually his court case led to the decriminalization of homosexuality in Canada.
Mhm. Can you in the film they talk a little bit about the history and the context and everything that was happening leading up to 1969.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what was it like back then? What changed in the 60s?
Yeah. So if you were gay or lesbian or transgender, you would have felt a lot of sort of cultural oppression. The community was quite marginalized. So people were very closeted if they even knew about if they even understood their identity. And it was very hard for people to meet and to find others like them. Um, there was a culture of intimidation sort of at large. And so in Calgary, for example, and many Canadian cities, if you ever were caught in a same-sex relationship, you would, the newspapers would publish your name and your home address and your occupation the next day before you've even gone to trial. So sort of guilty before you're, um, ever tested. And so there was huge level of pressure to be covert. There's a lot of shame attached to the community, which we still struggle with today to some extent. And it wasn't until later in the 60s that this case with Everett Clippert came up, and the Supreme Court said he should be incarcerated for life. He was a dangerous sexual offender, incurable. He would likely have sex with men if he got out of jail again. And so that was what was so dramatic. It wasn't just like a 4-year jail term, it was like a jail term for life. And so that's when sort of more progressives in Canada said, we think that's a little severe. Yes, we think it's a sin. Yes, we think it's ugly and unattractive and people shouldn't do it. But putting someone in jail forever because of their sexual orientation seems a little harsh, or a lot harsh. And that's what sort of was the beginning of a more organized gay liberation movement that came out of the late 60s, early 70s, which tied in with the Cultural Revolution and women's liberation and Black Power and all those sort of that uprising of minority politics that happened in the early 70s. Gay pride sort of came out of that, and the 70s became this real blossoming of the gay community across the country.
Hmm. Can you tell us more about what exactly is the 1969 bill? I think it was Bill C-150.
Correct.
It's been mentioned a couple. I mean, it's been mentioned in the film, but the specific terms seem like it was decriminalization, but it wasn't a complete solution. So there were still some situations where it would be a crime. I didn't really fully understand what it was.
Yeah, so Pierre Trudeau, who got elected in 1968 on this agenda to sort of modernize Canada, that was called Trudeau Mania at the time. He was very popular. He won a landslide victory. And so 1969, he presented this omnibus bill, C-150, and it wasn't just around homosexuality. It was a bunch of laws that he was changing to modernize the Canadian Criminal Code. And the details about C-150 when it comes to homosexuality is it legalized consensual sexual activity for 2 adults aged 21 or older in the privacy of their own home. So you can imagine all sorts of scenarios where that's not the case. If there's someone was 18, or if there were 3 people, or if they were in a public place, that was still considered a crime. Gross indecency was what the charge was. So it was sort of this narrow window of sort of approved sexual activity, but that was a big, that was a beachhead for the gay community. That was the first time that they had this one protected space in the privacy of their own home, because the police in Calgary and other places would entrap gay men. They would, with Everett Clipper, they came to his house and arrested him on allegations of homosexuality. So you weren't even safe sort of in the privacy of your own home. And so there are critics of Bill C-150 that said it was just a cosmetic change. It didn't really do that much, but I actually think it was important to give the gay community some comfort and some confidence going forward. And it's no coincidence in my mind that the gay liberation movement started to really blossom after that. Like, gay people felt safer to organize. And for a lot of Canadians who didn't understand the law, like yourself, you're asking about the technical details. In 1969, people didn't really understand it either, but they just thought Trudeau made gays legal, just with, and it was actually just this one behavioral or this one space that he had made legal. So,
right. So has there been additional laws that has changed since then? So the one thing that comes to my mind when you're explaining the bill is that in the public sphere it was still illegal, right? Which is a pretty large space. So has anything changed since then?
Yeah, there has been changes. The age of consent was lowered to 18. There are still laws on the books about sex in public spaces that affect heterosexuals, homosexuals, and things like that. There was also bawdy house laws, BAWDY, like houses of ill repute, prostitution. And we had quite a few bathhouse raids. Gay bathhouses were raided right up until 2002 in Calgary. And those laws, I'm not sure if they haven't changed, but policing has changed around some of these laws. So they're now, community standards have changed. And so certain laws are policed or not policed differently. But there are still some laws on the books that discriminate around homosexuality. For example, there's been a petition right up until recent times to lower the age of consent to 16 for anal sex, like it is for heterosexual sex, but vaginal sex. There seems to be a double standard, that there's this 2-year discrepancy. And then there's also people who advocate for the LGBTQ community. There's a ban on blood donations from gay men, or there's a time-limited donation because of the risk of HIV/AIDS. Even though they screen everyone who donates blood, sexually active men who have sex with men have restrictions on if they can donate blood. So those are sort of two outstanding bills. And then, of course, we didn't have human rights protections up until across the country until the late 90s. There was another Alberta case, Doan Vreend. His Supreme Court case made it illegal to discriminate based on sexual orientation. So, and then marriage in 2006. So the Clipper case, Bill C-150, was the first in many court cases that our community fought for and eventually won.
Okay, and there's many more bills to be fought for, right? Many more steps in that process.
There's a handful, yeah, but we've come quite far. And if you compare us to other countries around the world, we're doing reasonably well.
So I had a question from another volunteer at the festival. So she wanted to know what are the implications of Bill C? What is the legacy of Bill C-150 on the indigenous community? or in general, I guess in terms of how the gay community is treated. How has that affected the indigenous community?
I don't know if I've got a good answer for that question. Are we talking about gay rights generally from a two-spirit perspective, or are we talking specifically about this bill?
I think just from a general perspective, in the film, it does mention that before 1867, the indigenous community was much more accepting of individual members with different gender identities. But
Yeah.
that was about it, and it seems like everything else that happened afterwards, that wasn't mentioned anymore.
Okay, yeah, well, I can comment on that. The pre-colonial First Nations society did have a lot more space for different sexual orientations and gender identities. And it's sort of a colonial imposition, the homophobia and transphobia that was put on First Nations through residential schools and things like that. So homophobia and transphobia in First Nations communities is really a colonial legacy. Like, it wasn't something that was there before. Mm-hmm. There's an interesting story in Calgary, or proto-Calgary, the Siksika, the Blackfoot here. There was a French-Canadian settler named Jean Leroux who was born in the 19th century. He came out to Alberta in the latter half of the 19th century. He was like before Calgary existed. He was in the 1860s and 1870s. He was out here and he liked to have sex with men. Also, a problem for historians is we didn't really have gay identities back in the 19th century. So you have to read these things through a different kind of filter. But he wanted to be a priest. And he kept getting kicked out of seminary school and different missions for being caught in bed with other men. So sort of the Catholic brethren were really opposed to his behavior. But he ended up becoming quite nomadic here in the prairies and befriending the Siksika, the Blackfoot, and became really good friends with Chief Crowfoot, and became the most fluent Siksika speaker in the North. We were the Northwest Territories then. It was before Alberta. And he actually, at the signing of Treaty 7 at Blackfoot Crossing, very important for our history, he represented the chiefs in the negotiations because he was the best. He could translate what the Crown was saying. And the Crown actually tapped him on the shoulder. The government wanted him to translate on behalf of the Crown, the government. And he said no, he was on the Indians' side. He spoke for the Indians. And so Treaty 7 was physically in Calgary. It was on loan from Library and Archives Canada for the Canada 150 celebrations a few years ago. It was at Fort Calgary. And you could see Jean Leroux's signature. And so he found a greater sense of community and acceptance in the First Nations, in the 1870s than he did from, his own Catholic community here in Alberta. So that illustrates the sort of tolerance that existed in First Nations communities pre-contact, pre-colonial colonization.
Very, very cool. But definitely you can see there's a lot of gaps in history. I think this was also mentioned in the documentary, that a lot of the stories are just not told, right? Unless they're the story of the dominant community. Which then brings me to my next question about our education system. So obviously there are a lot of gaps and a lot of problems in our education system when it comes to talking about gay history and the community and just general understanding about this topic. So what would you say are some of the gaps in that education system, in our education system in Alberta? And where does Calgary Gay History come into play?
Okay. Yeah, I just want to emphasize what you just said about marginalized communities and their histories. Like they're not a dominant narrative, and when you do have a marginalized community that's criminalized and fearful, those histories get erased, even by the community itself. Like, for example, in the gay community, when AIDS was a real pandemic in the 80s and 90s, gay men would like destroy the evidence that they were gay before their families came, to, collect their bodies and stuff like that. So we as a community, not only were very secretive, but we were destroying our history. So education, I think, is important. I think that queer history should be incorporated into the Alberta curriculum. I think it would be really progressive. For example, before I started this project in 2012, I didn't know anything about Everett Clippard, and I've done a lot of work trying to rehabilitate his story, or bring his story back up to the surface, because even though he was front page news in the 60s, it just sort of disappeared. And yet his journey and almost his martyrdom, he didn't want to be a hero, he was a bit of an anti-hero, like changed the course of our human rights struggle in the country. And I knew nothing about it until I was in my 40s, and he grew up in Calgary, and, went to Crescent Heights, lived in Crescent Heights. And like, so I just feel like there's really important stories that get lost. And Calgary's not just about the Stampede or oil exploration. It has a lot of really rich histories. And I think we're starting to now, as a history community, or as historians, start to grapple with, the complexities of our histories and the intersectional nature of our histories. I went to the Alberta Archives in my research, maybe 2014, the Provincial Archives. Beautiful, purpose-built building, millions of, artifacts and citations and books and things like that. And I walked, and when you go to an archives, you have to like wear gloves and sign in, and, like put your phone, and you can only use a pencil. There's all these rules that you have to, that I did all my things. And I got to the center of the room where the archivist librarian was there. I said, can you give me all your citations about gay history in Alberta? And she plunked at the computer, and she could only find 2, in the whole provincial archives. And to be fair to her, some things are coded differently, right? Like if you're looking at early 20th century gay police records, it's not called homosexuality. It's, gross indecency, or it's you have to figure out what the right search terms are. But still, on that initial search, she only came up with 2 things. And she also said no one had ever asked before.
In the 100 years that Alberta existed.
At the Provincial Archives. So
wow.
That says something about sort of reclaiming the history. And then to be fair to the community, they've really embraced the Calgary Gay History Project. I did a very popular Kickstarter campaign that helped launch the book in 2018. And people have been really embracing the research that the History Project's done. So.
Very cool. I actually came across Calgary Gay History a while ago. So I knew about your organization, knew about the project before the screening, because at my workplace, we do training with the Center for Sexuality. So
okay.
Thanks that we've gotten some resources. So that brings up a couple questions. So my first question is, in terms of, I guess, the older members of the queer community, they've went through all of this, and they're the ones who survived, who came through. What role do you think they can play in terms of maybe telling that history or advocating for that history, or maybe they just don't want to be a part of any of these advocacy work?
Well, there's a range, based on personality, but a really key component of the History Project was oral history interviews with elders from our community, because we didn't have things like I just mentioned in the archives. There are no records, so getting people's memories and recollections was critical in starting to wrap my head around the history of Calgary's gay community. I quickly learned after I did my first interviews that many of them were hostile to the use of the word queer, which I'm very comfortable with, but was, used pejoratively or as an insult to them when they were growing up. Like that was a real difficult word for them. And so they still feel hostile to it. So I actually initially called my project the Calgary Queer History Project, and I changed it to the Gay History Project to kind of respect their contributions and their stories and to build trust with them. And so they're a super important aspect to the project. And we're at a critical time right now where those activists who started the first organizations in the 60s and 70s are now getting up there in age, like they're in their 80s and 70s. I've interviewed people right up until their 90s. And now the project's been going so long, some of the people I've interviewed have passed on. And so I really feel an urgency in recording their stories and getting them, because that decade, the 70s, is a really key one to understand the change that happened because of Bill C-150. And so getting those people's stories is super important. And many of them are really generous and willing to share. And for many, it's an affirmation, it's kind of an unburdening. It's like they've had a lot of, they've had a difficult past, and sort of acknowledging it and recognizing it and being honored for it, that they came through it, is a blessing. Yeah. There's other people who don't want to talk about it at all, who are just, like you said, they've compartmentalized it. It's, in the past,
so in terms of, I guess, the younger generation, and obviously there's this big gap between the older generation and the younger generation, but young people these days, they're facing a whole different set of situation. They're simultaneously more accepting, but also the schools are not always so accepting. So can you tell us a bit about what is it like for the younger people these days?
Yeah, so I'm 50, so I might not have a first-person perspective on what young people are facing. But I have sat in a few panels, like intergenerational queer panels, where you have like 70-year-olds and 20-year-olds on the same panel and talking about the sort of issues that they're facing. And one thing that's really struck me, and I guess it's not necessarily a queer thing, it could be a generational thing, is how disconnected young people feel to each other and just generally. It was remarkable to me when I was on this panel that the elders in our community are super connected. They're on the phone with each other all the time. Before COVID, they were like playing shuffleboard and they're doing this, and they're always like, they just have a really tight social life. And that generation really had to kind of clump together for safety. And as a result, they had the gay community had a really strong sense of community and identity and camaraderie, despite the hostility that was out there. And now, young queer people meet each other on apps, and there's sort of no gay spaces. Like gay bars have more or less disappeared. There's the odd, there's a few spaces left in the city, but not like the 70s and 80s where there were gay coffee shops, bookstores, restaurants, dance clubs. Like you could live in this gay world that didn't intersect with the straight world. And so I feel like there's a missing sense of community for young queer people a little bit. And they tell me that on the walks, when people come to the gay history walks that I do, that younger generation they're looking for a sense of community. And gay people have this funny thing about the elders in their community, because minority communities that are based on ethnicity, for example, have their parents, but young queer people usually come from straight families, and generally speaking, and so this intergenerational connection is not so easy or not so immediate.
Mm. Sounds really tough, and definitely a lot of work to be done. It seems to be the common theme here. Um, so there was another question about what the role of publications play in the daily life of the community. Obviously, back when there was actually physical printed copies of publications and newsletters, and so that was the first question, and the second part of the question is related to the internet and what you've mentioned about young people and online space. We like to think that the internet has replaced a lot of these printed materials very nicely, but it seems like that's not necessarily the case. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so right back to the early 1970, we had our first publications here in Calgary, and they were like, photocopied or mimeographed. It was even before photocopier, kind of like very, clip art, kind of very rough looking productions. But and magazines would be, if you were on a subscription list, they'd come in a manila envelope, so it would just be your address, so you wouldn't be outed by picking up this, getting the subscription. But that was a really important connector. I mean, for people who were sort of covert, it kind of gave you access. It was a key to the secret underground community that was the gay community in Calgary. And so right up until this century, those publications were really important listings of community groups. In the late 80s and 90s, the gay community really blossomed. And there was, like, you name the group. There was the choir, there was the sporting group, there was the lots of different, whatever your interests were, you could find a group to connect to. And then the gay commercial establishments that I mentioned, like the bookstores and coffee shops and stuff, usually had a bulletin board that posted all the community's events as well, or had the newsletters there. So for you to be connected to the community, you physically had to show up in these spaces, and that was an opportunity to maybe bump into your friends and have a conversation with the person behind the counter. And it was it was just a very well knit thing. So today there's a lot of information on the internet, but I feel like the relationships don't have the same fiber. If I can use a nutritional metaphor, like it's like junk food or something like that. Like, it tastes good, but somehow it doesn't give you that long-term health benefit that you're looking for. I mean, there's lots of documentaries about sort of the dark side of social media and things like that. And I'm watching the Fairy Tales Queer Film Festival right now. It's on Zerb as well. And there's just some really interesting feature films where their opening night film had these men who were, hooking up for sex on Grindr or whatever the app was, but they weren't connecting as people, and so technology has created these new sort of ways of being that maybe aren't doing us, I don't know, maybe aren't serving all of our needs.
Yeah, definitely. I think that might be a bigger problem. It's a problem for everyone.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just the gay community or the queer community. Yeah.
So next question. In terms of terminology, if you mentioned that some of the older community find the word queer very offensive, and then I've heard some other people have mentioned that, well, the word gay doesn't really refers to the whole community. And then there's all these acronyms. At first it was LGBTQ, and now it's, I believe the film mentioned LGBTQAI 2S plus. So what is the right term to use, if there's even one?
So many people ask me this question, especially like well-meaning allies who just want to get it right, and say the right thing. Unfortunately, it's a slippery slope and it's constantly changing and it's hard to stay on top of. And that is right through the history of our community. I have a chapter or an endnote in my book about, when you're writing about queer history, like what term do you use? And that kind of depends on the decade that you're talking about. Queer was actually used in the early 20th century in New York by the queer community and then was forgotten and then sort of reclaimed. Queer is what I really like because I came out in the early 90s when AIDS activism was at its peak, and that's when the community reclaimed that word as a from it being pejorative and gave it a sense of power and ownership. I was astounded to learn when I was doing my research that lesbian was once considered a controversial word. It was feminist and uppity, and there was a generation of women who were gay women, and lesbian was too, modern and for them. So sometimes you can't win with the language, but the federal government right now is using LGBTQ2, two being two-spirit, which is the First Nations, incorporates First Nations, gender and sexually diverse people. And that's a manufactured concept from the 90s that the First Nations came up with to express an umbrella term for their sense of gender and sexually diverse people. Because each First Nation has its own, they have so many languages and there's so many different words, so they were looking for a unifying word. But some people are now using GSD, gender and sexually diverse, just to like make the acronym a lot shorter. We'll see. We'll see. I mean, queer is often used as an umbrella term for everything, whether it's a perfect fit or not. So it's a good question. There's no answer to it.
Okay, that's okay. We'll take a hint from whoever we're talking to and then go with it, right?
Exactly.
So last question. If any of our viewers want to take some action and learn more about this topic, or to advocate or do some work in this area, what are some organizations that are still working in this space?
Yeah, so people can go to the Calgary Gay History Project if they want to learn more about queer history in Calgary. And I've done a book, and there's a film on YouTube that people can track down to learn more about queer history. If people want to engage sort of with the queer community, the Calgary Outlink is our peer support organization that's in community-wise on 12th Avenue there, which is a center for nonprofit organizations. And it's been in that space in various incarnations right back to 1973. And they provide education, resources, and peer support to the queer community, and have been doing so for decades. So people who are struggling with their sexual orientation or gender identity can often find support there. They're a registered charity, so people could make a donation or find out what the needs are. Another agency for the trans community is Skipping Stone, which does really important work around trans advocacy. And then you mentioned Center for Sexuality in Calgary does really good education training for any group, really. And they do some peer support work as well. So if you or anyone is struggling with issues of gender and sexual identity, I would encourage them to reach out to those organizations.
Awesome. I have one more question. I'm sorry, I missed it.
That's okay.
And it's a very important question. So one of the other volunteers at the festival wanted to know what role did gay bars, and I will add to that and say, what role did these spaces for the gay community play in helping pave the way for trans people to be more accepting?
That's a good question. So I mean, the reason we had all those spaces in the past was because we had a hostile community at large, and we needed to kind of like create safe places for ourselves. So I guess that created a legacy um, of protection, which maybe helped advance trans rights forward. I can say though that it's complicated. The trans community and say the gay or lesbian community don't always get along. There's some frictions, but trans people often, I can think of a lot of examples, felt a level of comfort and safety in some of these historic gay bars in Calgary in the 70s and 80s, and worked there, performed there, and felt safe there. So these spaces tended to be safe because the outside was so oppressive. And even back in the 50s and 60s, you'd find lesbians, gay men, and trans people kind of in these very divey blue collar bars. Like in Calgary, we had the lesbians drinking at the Cecil Hotel because it was sort of where all marginalized peoples ended up. Mm. And so in a way, you know, if society is sort of pressing you down on the thumb, spaces get created that are sort of, you know, owned by these communities, and they protect each other to some extent.
Okay. Oh, definitely a lot to learn from there. That was I feel like I opened a can of worms, but
yeah,
but that's okay.
That's a big that was a can of worms. You're right.
But that's okay. Go to these organizations that you mentioned, and then we learn more, right? Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Kevin.
Thanks, Lily.
Thank you for joining us, and
Yeah,
I hope you will join us for the film screening.
I will, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to take this time to thank you again for supporting the Marda Loop Justice Film Festival. Our festival could not have survived without your continuous support. If you enjoy what you saw today, please consider making a small donation. We are a nonprofit festival and rely on the generosities of our supporters to keep the festival free of charge and accessible. The donation link can be found on the CERT TV film subscription page or on our festival's website, justicefilmfestival.ca.